Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor, New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown. Welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where today we are going to continue our examination of Leviticus chapter 20, which we find in the second part of our series. Remember, we started with understanding the context of the book of Leviticus, then moved on to understanding the content, where we're kind of exploring, not in a super detailed way, but certainly trying to go through each of the chapters to discover the content that's in the book and the lessons it has for us. And also intermixed in that is the third step, which is understanding the completion of the book of Leviticus, which is how the content points forward to the person and work of our Lord Jesus. And so we are in this section covering instructions for holiness. And we looked at chapter 20 last week, which is concerned with laws that regulate the holiness of the people, particularly that separates them, that makes them holy from the practices of the Canaanites into the land in which they're going, and also separates them from the practices of the Egyptians, the land from which they have recently been delivered. Remember, they're wandering in the wilderness, and they receive these instructions at Mount Sinai that are recorded for us in the book of Leviticus, and then they'll eventually enter into the promised land in the book of Joshua. So again, that's more about the context of the book of Leviticus. But chapter 20, we talked a little bit last time about law, judgment, and grace. We see these features in this chapter. And specifically, we looked at divine precepts. What are the laws that are given in the book? But also, in this particular chapter, along with the laws or the precepts that are given, there are specific punishments that are to be levied by the people according to the instructions of the Lord. And so we want to consider a little bit of those divine punishments in this lesson. And then also consider divine preservation. There's grace in this chapter as well. So we want to be able to detect and appreciate the components of grace that we see here in Leviticus chapter 20. We left off looking at this aspect of the judgments in the book of Leviticus. Remember, we looked at the precepts under two broad categories. There are laws dealing with the violations of worship, and laws dealing with the violation of sexual relationship, those two components in chapter 20. And along with those precepts, we get punishments announced, varying degrees of punishments that are announced. We do see one of the punishments being death, announced in verses 2, 9, and variously for violations recorded in verses 10 through 16. We see this language of the people being cut off from before the Lord, verses 17 and 18. The punishment of childlessness is mentioned in verses 19 and 21. There might be a connection between death and being cut off. Maybe that means the same thing. There might be a connection between cut off and being childless, which might be the same thing as well. So we've talked a little bit about this language of being cut off from the covenant people before. But today, in this lesson, I want to consider this question. This is where we left off last time, and that's should Christians endorse the death penalty today? And if so, what infractions should the death penalty be levied? There's a lot of varying opinions about this, certainly in the broader cultures throughout the world. But even within the Christian community, there's debates and differences about the legitimacy of the death penalty. There certainly seems to be a warrant for it consistently throughout the Old Testament, not only because of these divine punishments we're reading about here in Leviticus and elsewhere, but we read very early on in Genesis chapter 9 about whoever destroys the image of God or whoever sheds blood by man shall his shed be blood, for man is created in his image. I'm going off the top of my head, but I think that's the actual language of that we find there in Genesis chapter 9. That would certainly seem to give warrant to the exercise of the death penalty very early on in Genesis 9. And then we see this unfolding of laws and punishments that are specifically revealed by the Lord, including death. And so how are we to think about this today, however? Well, if the death penalty is to be instituted and is to be an instrument of the state, a couple things to keep in mind. More than a couple. Let me mention, I think I've got 5 here in this lesson. And so think about this, that if the death penalty is to be levied, it is levied as retributive justice in cases of murder, specifically, with clear, irrefutable evidence. Obviously, one of the arguments against the death penalty is it's irretractable. So if evidence comes up that the innocent was actually condemned and executed with the death penalty, there's no recourse for that, obviously. And so if the death penalty is to be utilized as an instrument of the state, it would seem that it's appropriate only in cases of murder where clear and irrefutable evidence of the guilt of the criminal or the perpetrator is found. And the reason for this, it's not, you can't have justice where there's restitution being given in any regard, because by the nature of the crime, the victim is deceased. And so nothing can be restored to them in any kind of a way. And so obviously the death penalty is to be seen as retributive punishment, justice, and it secures justice specifically for the deceased. Many who argue against the death penalty argue that it doesn't bring the person back for the loved ones. It doesn't reduce the grief that they experience, and all that may legitimately be true, but I think that misses the point of the argument for proponents of the death penalty, and that is, how do you secure justice for the person who was murdered? Notice I have murder in italics here, because I think we have to be very clear that not all forms of killing are murder. We make those distinctions in our laws. Clearly, we have first-degree manslaughter, second-degree manslaughter. There's people who die accidentally. There's people who are killed as a result of being an intruder in someone's home. And those people who are protecting themselves, their loved ones, their homes, are not charged with any kind of crime, actually, let alone charged with murder, because it's not murder. Soldiers who kill others in war are not regarded as murderers. And so we need to make sure that we're talking about the crime of murder specifically here when we're talking about the death penalty. And it is justice for the deceased. Because, again, how do you secure justice for someone from whom everything was taken? You can't restore time. Wounds cannot heal. Their life has been snuffed out, possibly through torture, through a long period of suffering, perhaps at the hand of the perpetrator. And so what does justice look like for that person whose life has been taken? Well, the argument is that the justice is the taking of the life of the murderer, to restore the balance, the scales, to restore balance to the scales of justice. But we have to be obviously very careful. Again, clear, irrefutable evidence of the intent, of perhaps the premeditation of the act. It's not just a crime of passion, although that may also fall under here. That again, there's debates about the specific applications and instances in which this would be applicable, but certainly in cases where a murder has occurred with clear, irrefutable evidence, in order to secure justice for the deceased, the death penalty seems to be warranted scripturally. Another thing to consider, however, with the use of the death penalty as an instrument of justice is that there should be consistent application of the law, regardless of race or class. A couple of reasons I bring this up. Many have pointed out the disproportionate number of minorities who are sentenced to death through the death penalty. And so obviously we want to look into the factors of that and make sure that that's not an instance of systemic racism operating in the justice system where there's a disproportionate number of individuals, minorities specifically, who are sentenced with the death penalty. Also, class comes into play because our legal system allows people to hire lawyers, and certainly that allows people who have more money to hire perhaps the more skilled lawyers in order to have a sentence reduced, even where murder has occurred. And so obviously there are problems with the justice system as it currently stands that would need to be addressed. And where the death penalty is to be advocated for, we would want to advocate for a consistent application of it in those instances which are under the first bullet point: retributive justice in cases of murder with clear, irrefutable evidence, securing justice for the deceased regardless of race or class. We also have to see death penalty as an authorized act of the state. Again, if we don't believe that the death penalty is a warranted part of the justice system, that it's not an authorized act, but where it is in effect, we need to see it as an authorized act of the state. It's not a personal act of vengeance. That makes a huge difference. The state is acting in its official capacity to render justice, where persons take it upon themselves to render that justice. We call those people vigilantes, and so there's a big difference between that even where there's many crimes. I don't know enough about our legal system to say this definitively, but there are tons of cases where it's the state versus so-and-so and not an individual versus so-and-so. And I think capital cases are that way. The case is made by the state to restore justice for the deceased. In other words, it's not my case against someone who has murdered someone close to me. I'm not prosecuting that individual. The state is prosecuting that person as part of the official functions of the state. When I say official, I mean it involves state officials. There are offices involved in that. And so as a citizen, I'm not putting anybody to death, but I do entrust the state to secure justice for those who have been murdered and to bring people to justice through the death penalty. Again, if it's an authorized act of the state. But we need to make sure, I think, in many instances today, we've lost a sight of what it means to occupy an office. We kind of think democratically as if everything is flattened out. We think that way, but only in certain instances where we kind of recognize that, say, an officer of the court gets to levy a sentence that I don't get to levy. My opinion actually doesn't matter whether I think someone's innocent or guilty if I'm not on a jury and if I'm not a judge appointed by the court as an officer. We recognize that that person has a responsibility to render a sentence that doesn't belong to anybody else by virtue of that person's office. And so the state is functioning in an official capacity, and the act of the state is not vengeance to put someone to death. Sometimes the argument is the death penalty is just an act of revenge, and that's certainly not true. One of the things I could mention here too, especially connected to this idea of all killing being murder, that if the state puts someone to death, it's murdering someone just like the murderer murdered them. It's not. When someone unjustly takes the life of another person, for the state to execute that person is not parallel at all. If we are going to say that every murder is let me say it this way. If we're going to say that every taking of a life is equally unethical, then God is a murderer. Because God is the giver of life, but he's also ultimately the one who takes life. And so, but it's interesting, isn't it, that biblically speaking, God takes life as a form of justice. The wages of sin is death. Death enters the world through sin. We read about both of those things in Romans chapters 5 and 6. And so death is an aspect of justice. And so where blood has been shed, where innocent blood has been shed, for the state to function as really an arm of God, which Romans 13 talks about, is not to commit a parallel crime to the murderer. It is to act in justice, specifically for the deceased. Also, it's important that we treat people as responsible moral agents who have consequences for their actions. In other words, people who commit crimes are not merely products of their environment. The choices that people make are their own choices. Now, certainly environments can be influencing factors, but we can't excuse sin, or we can't excuse criminal conduct simply on the basis of someone's environment. We want to treat people as responsible moral agents and hold them accountable for their choices and for their actions, even if those consequences happen to be very severe. One of the things I might add to this fourth point is to treat uncompromised people as responsible moral agents. One of the other concerns about the death penalty is how many people who have mental illnesses are on death row, or how many people with mental illness have been put to death through the death penalty. That's a problem. And I personally, I would not be an advocate of levying the death penalty for someone who has clear mental impairments. But that gets tricky. I think that's a gray area. that's not easy to speak to, but even with gray areas, you don't necessarily say, well, that solves it. There shouldn't be any death penalty at all, even for those who are uncompromised and who have committed heinous crimes where there's irrefutable evidence of that crime. But there are areas that I think get tricky. We need to acknowledge those. And then finally, I think when we think about the death penalty, even as Christians, because we serve a God who is merciful and full of grace, and because there's forgiveness even for the murderer. I mean, we think about David, who was involved in the death of Uriah, indirectly, but certainly the cause behind Uriah's death. Moses murdered an Egyptian before he fled to Midian and isn't put to death for that murder. We do serve a God who's full of grace and mercy and forgiveness. But we have to remember that there are things that are worse than physical death. And so even if someone's on death row, even if a criminal is put to death in order to secure justice for the deceased, that's not the worst thing that could happen to that person. If that person is trusting, let's say that person undergoes a conversion after the murder, a conversion while they're in prison, awaiting the execution of the death penalty, and they come to faith in Jesus, and the Christian would think, well, that means that they shouldn't actually be punished any longer for their crime. That doesn't mean that at all. They've committed a civil offense, and there's civil punishments for that offense, but they can certainly be forgiven for that and not experience the second death, as the Bible talks about it. And so we can think the death penalty is the worst thing that the state could do, but there are worse things than physically dying. And there's still the possibility of grace, forgiveness, and eternal life held out even to the most heinous murderer if they would repent and put their faith in Jesus. But that doesn't remove or lift civil penalties to secure justice on a horizontal plane. Okay, so just some considerations there to think about to this question. But there's a couple other questions here, I think, in Leviticus chapter 20. Notice that the whole community seems to be involved in executing the sentence against those who have given their children over to Moloch. We talked about that last week. Not sure whether this means giving the children over as a sacrifice to Moloch, and so the child dies, or giving over the children to the worship of Moloch. In either case, it's viewed as spiritual adultery and a covenant violation, and that person who did that is to be put to death, and it's actually the whole community. Now, the people of the land are to stone that person with stones. So again, we were talking about official capacity here of the state to execute criminals, where it's not a personal thing. But then we look back in Leviticus, and there we have it, where the whole community seems to be involved. Why was that the case? Well, it certainly would have reinforced communal assent and submission to the justice of divine law, would likely have served as a deterrent for someone to witness that, and certainly where it involved issues of the purity of worship. We talked about last time that the severity of laws generally reflect the highest of values. The more severe punishments are reserved for the highest values that are violated. And of course, at the top of the list in terms of the supreme value of the covenant community in Israel was the worship and obedience to their covenant God. And so this is a clear violation of that, and the people were called to all be involved in executing that sentence as a reflection of community assent and submission to God's revealed word here. Which leads us maybe to another question, and that is, why doesn't the church consistently call for the penalties listed in Leviticus 20 today? Well, very good question. Or maybe the church should call for the death penalty in these exact instances. But of course, we don't have the death penalty for adultery, for instance, which is clearly stated here in Leviticus chapter 20. So what do we think about those? Well, quick answer to that. Remember that Israel is a theocracy, which means that Israel itself was both a religious commonwealth, but also a civil entity. It was a distinct nation that was governed by God's law. That's what theocracy means. So the civil and religious aspects were joined, were completely intertwined, while that's not true of the church today. Certainly there's continuity between Israel in the Old Testament and the church in the New Testament as the covenant people, but there's discontinuity as well. The church is not identical with Israel. in the New Testament. The New Testament church is not identical with Israel in the Old Testament in all ways. There is some forms of discontinuity there. And the New Testament church is dispersed throughout many nations. It doesn't consist primarily of one nation, as Israel did, but it's dispersed throughout many nations, which means that the church exists under various civil authorities that have been entrusted by God with the use of the sword. That's Romans, again, 13. The church has not been entrusted with the use of the sword. Instead, the church is to exercise spiritual discipline. We see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where actually one of these violations that we read about in Leviticus 20 is occurring in the church in Corinth. A man has taken his father's wife. And Paul, in that passage, does not call for the death of the individual. He calls for the removal of that individual from the covenant community, from the assembly, to put that person out. That's an act of spiritual discipline, not an act of civil punishment. And so what's been entrusted to the church today is spiritual discipline. And even having said that, there does seem to be maybe a lessening of the severity of some of those laws, because Paul doesn't call for the death of that individual. I guess we don't specifically know what he would have advocated on a civil level for that, but he doesn't mention it. His concern is the spiritual discipline of the church, not the civil execution of the violator. And so that's why we don't see the church necessarily implementing these specific divine laws and punishments in the context of the new covenant. Okay, again, lots of things to kind of think through there as well, but that's the simple answer for why we are not advocates of implementing Old Testament law exactly along the lines of the way we see it. Simple answer again: discontinuities between Israel as a theocracy and the church spread throughout many nations existing under various civil authorities. Certainly, though, the spiritual discipline needs to be something that is taken very seriously and consistently and faithfully taken on and executed, which is something that's lessening more and more where there's spiritual violations. And so we think that, well, that's a lesser form. It's actually not a lesser form. It's very serious, and a lot of churches have failed to faithfully practice spiritual discipline and church discipline. That's just as important. Last thing we'll cover here very quickly: divine preservation. There's grace in this chapter. So there's divine precepts, law. There's divine punishments, judgment. But there's also divine preservation. There's grace, because warnings are a form of grace in the covenant, where God is warning his people, deterring his people from adopting what ultimately are destructive and sinful patterns of the nations around them, lest they would come under the same judgment. If the Israelites adopt these patterns, the land will vomit them out as well. That's what we read in verses 22 through 26. There's a holy land for a holy people. And if the people are not holy, if the people are not separate, they will be exiled from the land as well. And actually, that's exactly what happens in the Old Testament. But just as the Canaanites were driven out for their wickedness, the Israelites would be driven out for their wickedness as well. And so they're warned about these things ahead of time as a form of divine preservation and grace. It just reinforces that sin is serious and it brings judgment. Jesus has not changed that. Jesus has certainly removed the eternal punishments from the believer because of sin, but sin still has consequences and has temporal punishments. And again, Jesus has not changed that, and so it's important for people to recognize that. And keep in mind, the severity of these penalties in Leviticus 20 are very severe. Again, death penalty, being cut off, childlessness. But notice that the violations deal with religious foundations of worship, not giving children over to Moloch, not going over to mediums or necromancers, not cursing father or mother, basic family relationships, the integrity of sexual relationships in a family. All of those serve to give stability and shalom to the kingdom. When those things begin being disregarded and violated, you have collapse. Violating God's pattern and laws leads to destructive, abusive, sterile, self-indulgent, and confused cultures. Not entirely difficult for, I think, modern citizens of the U.S. to relate to: destructive, abusive, sterile, self-indulgent, confused cultures. That's what happens when you violate God's pattern for worship and for basic family relationships. Alan Ross, in his commentary, says a nation whose families break down like this could not hope to endure long. Ross is just simply correct. He also says in his commentary just about the general theme of the chapter that is captured this way: God's people are to reject the world's false religious systems and the world's immoral practices and live according to God's order and design for worship and relationships. God's order, God's design. That's the pathway to stability. That's the pathway to shalom. And we're called to strive to obey him as a people who are rescued from judgment by Jesus and preserved and empowered by grace. In other words, again, this chapter is calling us to be set apart spiritually. That doesn't mean that we are to withdraw from culture, to withdraw from the world, physically or geographically. It's not a call to be Amish. We are set apart spiritually in the way that we live, in the values that we hold, the level of our hearts. We are set apart from the world, reflecting a different quality of life in the Spirit. That's what holiness means, and that's what we're called to because we have been redeemed by God's gracious work. Remember, Leviticus and these laws are given to a people who are redeemed from their bondage to Egypt. They don't have to fulfill these laws in order to be redeemed. And also, for the Christian, it's not the law that redeems us. It's Jesus who redeems us, but he redeems us to be a holy people, and he gives us his Spirit to empower us to do that, to live as a redeemed people. And so that's what we strive for. We're going to continue to look at the next chapters in Leviticus, chapters 21 and 22, about some regulations about the priesthood and the sacrifices next time. So hopefully you'll come back and join us then.